Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Open University.
Welcome back. Now we'll look at translation theory in the last half a century and more. Right. So I think we reached the point where structuralism tried to intervene in translation studies nearly up to the 60s of the last century. Now let's see what happened afterwards. Okay. Now, this discipline called translation studies, it came into being only in the 1970s. Earlier you used to talk about translation, but neither about translation theory or about translation studies. So it was James S. Holmes who gave the name translation studies to this discipline. In this essay called The Name and Nature of Translation Studies, published in 1970. Okay, that was part of a conference. It was a paper he presented at a conference, and then this paper was made available for publication. So he classified translation studies in several ways. There were descriptive and theoretical translation studies. Translation studies which described already available translations. Okay, trying to find mostly people used to find faults with translation. This was not what it should have been, so on. That is a descriptive translation, but not necessarily. Some translation scholars simply try to look at what actually happened when a particular translator made a choice. And then theoretical translation studies about how translation can be done, the intricacies of the process, etc. That was theoretical translation studies. Further, it could be divided into product-oriented translation studies, process-oriented translation studies, and function-oriented translation. We will look at function-oriented translation studies next, after we finish with Holmes. And then there are medium-restricted translations. Translation studies which deal with translation in a particular medium. Area-restricted translations in particular discourses. Translations in discourses in science, medicine, in law, in literature. Rank-restricted translation at what level? At the level of word, phrase, etc. Discourse-restricted, a larger kind of deliberation on translation in particular discourses. Okay, a little different from area-restricted translation. And then problem-restricted and time-restricted translation theories. Translation of a particular problem in translation. How to translate, for instance, place names. How to those things which were discussed later by Peter Newmark in his book Approaches to Translation. Time-restricted translation. Translation theories occurring at a particular period of time. Right. So these are the ways in which James S. Holmes divided translation studies. And then a little later came what came to be known as the Scopus theory of translation. Scopus means purpose. Why do you translate? Or for whom do you translate? What is the purpose of translation? Okay, but very practical. Not looking at how it is done, not looking at what happened when a particular translation was done, but why people are translating. So there are particular translation strategies which are determined by the purpose that you are translating for. So if you are translating for a particular audience, if you are translating for the purpose of education, if you are translating for the purpose of entertainment, so all these purposes offer or demand different translation strategies. So you have people like Hans Vermeer, Catherine Rice, Christian Node discussing, and later on Anton Popovich discussing the purpose of translation. Okay, especially in what you call committed translation. Okay, translation with a definite aim in mind. And later on, you will find that even feminist translation studies basically looks at scopus, purpose. And then at the end of the 1970s, scopus theory was launched in the 1970s. After that, the polysystem theory was launched at the end of the 1970s in what was called systems thinking or visualizing literature. This is a particularly literature-centered theory. Visualizing literature as a polysystem, a system of systems. Okay, imagine a circle and smaller circles placed within the circle. So this group of literary translation theorists looked at how translated literature was placed within a literary polysystem. So a literature is a polysystem. It consists of several smaller systems like children's literature, women's literature, detective fiction, okay, popular literature, serious literature, etc. So translated literature also occupied a position as a system within this polysystem. So where do you place it? By where, they meant either at the center or somewhere in the margins. So translation would occupy an important role in a culture where translated literature was placed at the center of its literary polysystem. Right. So you have all these people discussing that. Itamar Ibn Zohar, Zohar Shavit, Menachem Perry, Shoshana Blum Kalka, and many others as well. And Israel seems to be the center for discussion for the polysystem theory of translation studies. Now, just a few years later, in 1983, translation studies was given recognition as a separate discipline. More than 10 years after James S. Holmes named the discipline. So in the annual bibliographies published by the Modern Languages Association of America, translation studies was given a separate entry in 1983. So you can say 1983 was the birth year of translation studies. Earlier, translation studies used to be grouped under applied linguistics. Now you have a separate entry for it. So immediately after, almost at the same time, there emerged a new school of translation studies called the Rewriting Culture School of Translation Studies. All these people, there is a large array of translation scholars were associated. I'll just spell out a few names. André Lefebvre, of course, and then Susan Bassett, Mary Snell-Hornby, Theo Hermans, Anthony Pym, Lawrence Venuti, Michael Cronin. So what were these people doing? First, they were visualizing translation as a form of rewriting. So far we were looking at translation as an activity which always had the original text at its back. Although one could polish the original text in translation. One could go for sense for sense translation. The original was always there as a lump. We can't get rid of it. We can't think of moving too far away from it. But these translation scholars, this group of translation scholars in the rewriting culture school thought of translation, visualized translation, essentially as a form of rewriting. It cannot but be rewriting. Okay. And they also said that translation happens not between languages, but between cultures. And why was translation a form of rewriting for those scholars? Because there were two factors at work, ideology and poetics, which could not be the same for two cultures. Both the SL culture and the TL culture, more often than not, had different ideological paradigms as their hegemonic paradigms. So you have to take into account both the ideological factors and the aesthetic factors, what is called poetics. So if the target language does not allow something to be said in the same way as it is done in the source language, we call it a divergence of poetics. For example, once upon a time, certain literatures could not permit free verse. You needed to write poems in verse alone. So that was an aesthetic hurdle. This had to be overcome. And certain cultures did not allow certain subjects to be discussed. You could not discuss sex openly. Okay. You could not discuss certain kinds of violence openly. Certain social conventions could not be discussed, etc. So a translation has to take into account all these when a translation is done. Right. And these translation scholars noted that either the translation scholar forcibly brought smuggled items into the target language by adopting a different ideological and aesthetic paradigm from the target language. The translator's own ideological and aesthetic paradigms. Or the translator the translator willingly accepted, embraced the paradigms of the target language and altered the source language text accordingly. So it can happen both ways, right? And this developed into many areas. I will talk about that now. There was something called post-colonial translation studies. Okay, something I mentioned in the last module, how post-colonial translation studies developed in a big way, offering, for example, resistance to colonial hegemony. Colonial hegemony which is continuing as neo-colonial hegemony. So one had to oppose it. One had to work against it in the process of translation. How in translation you could deconstruct this neo-colonial hegemony. So you have people like Harish Trivedi, Tejaswini Niranjana, Susan Bassnett, and Michael Cronin discussing how this can be done. Okay. And it reaches an extreme in a movement called anthropophagia or cannibalism, where the translator virtually cannibalizes the source text. Okay, swallows it whole and brings out something entirely different. Okay, and anthropophagia was also another means of asserting the translator's identity. Yeah, so the translator was always in the shadows. Okay, playing second fiddle to the author. So the exponents of the cannibalistic paradigm in translation demanded that the translator's name be published with a larger font on the cover. Sometimes the original author's name was not published at all. In other ways, marginalizing the author and valorizing the translator. And you have the name of Haroldo de Campos, okay, literary theorist, artist, who was actually reviving a theory which was popular in Brazil in the 1920s. Campos was operating in the 1960s. So this was, as we find, a means of asserting the identity of the translator. Something which Lawrence Venuti discussed in detail in his book, The Translator's Invisibility, published in 1998. Right. And you also have feminist translation studies as another offering another paradigm of resistance. Like, for example, looking at translation in terms of gender inequality. The giver, the source language, source culture, acting the role of the male in translation, while the receiver language acting as a female. This is one particular paradigm that was constructed. Okay. Then the attempt at unraveling patriarchal codes in the original text by means of very sensitive translation, bringing out the patriarchal codes, how they operated in the original text. Appropriating patriarchal discourse by deliberately introducing elements into the translation which would subvert patriarchal hegemony. We find all these important translation scholars at work. Olga Castro, Emek Ergun, Helen Vasello, Louis von Flotto. All these translation scholars seriously working for producing a feminist ethos in translation studies. And then something very dramatic happens at the beginning of the 21st century. A new branch of studies emerges, actually as an offshoot of translation studies. This was adaptation studies. And three texts which were published in the same year launches the movement. One was an essay by John Milton called Translation Studies and Adaptation Studies. The others, one, Linda Hutchins' Theory of Adaptation, and the third one, Julie Sanders' Adaptation and Appropriation, all three being published in 2006. Now, although this theoretical launching is new, what they were doing actually was to theorize a very old practice. So we have been doing it for a long time. We have been adapting texts. We have been producing adaptations which diverged radically from the original. I talked about what happened to the translations of the Ramayana, what happened to the adaptation of stories from the Purana and epics by Kalidasa for his plays. So they were adaptations. They were moving away, the authors were moving away far from the original text. So we have been practicing it for a long time. We have been adapting literary texts for performing arts. We have been adapting them for painting, for music. We have been doing it for a long time. Now these people and those who followed them tried to theorize such adaptations. Okay, so now I think I've covered the important areas, the whole terrain of translation studies in the second half of the 20th century. So here are some references for you. The old two texts, Mona Baker's Encyclopedia of Translation Studies, Susan Bassett's Translation Studies. These are familiar to you. And now we have Susan Bassett and Arish Trivedi editing a volume called Post-Colonial Translation, Theory and Practice. Olga Castro and Emek Ergin editing a volume titled Feminist Translation Studies, Local and Transnational Perspectives. James S. Holmes' essay, which I mentioned, The Name and Nature of Translation Studies. Linda Hutchins, A Theory of Translation. Andre Lefebvre and Susan Bassett together producing a volume called Translation History and Culture. This is an edited volume. John Milton's essay, Translation Studies and Adaptation Studies. Julie Sanders, Adaptation and Appropriation. Yorick Will's Machine Translation, Its Scope and Limits. Okay, a very comprehensive work. Tells you how well machine translation works and how at certain points it stumbles. So now we come to the end of translation theory post 1950. Thank you.